In this section we're going to talk about some of the security risks associated with databases, specifically things like hackers, data corruption, data integrity, in-house data compromises. And in the next video we're going to take an in-depth look at SQL injection. But there are more risks associated with databases that can impact on them than we can cover within any reasonably length video. And if you are interested in databases to the point that if you are a database administrator, you should probably spend some time on database administrator-centric forums, where the risks can be discussed and possible solutions identified. So the first specific topic we're going to look at is hackers. Within our database, we're obviously organising a lot of data, hopefully in an understandable and legible way. And hopefully your enterprise is going to be successful, which means that eventually your system is going to be targeted by a hacker. You should therefore make it as difficult as possible to actually access your database from the outside world, and there are a lot of different options available to do this. Some of these things include things like closely managing your user permissions, so that only the people who specifically needs to access each individual row, table, column are able to access them. And as we discovered in our user permissions section, you are able to limit this to specific columns within specific tables. Another option commonly used is to configure your database to only respond to queries originating from a specific IP address. And that IP address would obviously be the IP address of the web server. So that could either be on the same machine or a separate machine entirely. But by limiting your MySQL server to only respond to queries which originated from a specific IP address, you're essentially able to tell it to ignore every other IP address in the world. And this is a very easy way to cut off communications from potentially harmful people such as hackers. Probably the biggest risk to your database and your company is data integrity and data corruption issues. As we're going to cover in the next video about SQL injection, if you don't protect against it, it's extremely easy for your database to become accessible to the entire world. But more than this, it's possible for people to act maliciously and drop tables and delete rows and columns from your database. They can even insert data into your database which makes no sense, which then corrupts the entire structure of your database. And this is where things like primary keys and foreign keys help to mitigate the risks, because they protect against nonsense being inserted into your databases. And as we discovered when we were talking about triggers, we can provide validation on even specific rows and specific columns, even if they're not a primary key or a foreign key. It's also worth acknowledging that not all malicious activity actually originates from outside of your company. If you have unhappy employees with too many permissions and too much access, they can do far more damage to any company assets than any external person could ever do, simply because they have access and more opportunity to do so. So don't neglect to manage the permissions of your own staff. We've already mentioned some of these, but when you're managing your database, you should make sure you're using access controls properly and wherever you can. Don't give access to people or users who won't need access just because it may make things easier and quicker in the short term. We've already mentioned it before, but views and procedures limit what data your users can access extremely well. If you give a user access to a view and nothing else, the data in that view is all that they can view within your entire database, which means that user is less of a risk for your database. Now, under security also comes things like backup and recovery. It may sound like an obvious thing, but make sure that you're regularly making backups of your databases. If you're relying on a third-party web hosting partner to host your database as well as your website, take some time to check out what, if any, backup strategy they have in place, and make a decision about whether that's good enough for your needs, and if not, implement your own backup strategy. It's frequently the case that web host companies may make daily backups, but if you have a high volume of customers using your website, that may not be enough for you. Losing a whole day's data may mean losing hundreds of customers' details, which is a lot of details to lose. Don't be afraid to encrypt your data either. It technically requires more computer power to encrypt data than not to, but your customers are going to expect you to protect their details with encryption. The extra horsepower required to encrypt data may not be significant when it's the make or break factor when a customer is deciding whether to use your application or not. There's also a bunch of hardware solutions that can help your database's security, including firewalls, proxy servers, RAID setups, as well as other software solutions, which include things like SSH. The topic of security is huge, and so we obviously can't cover much more here, but do be aware of many of these technologies' existence, and do feel free to actually research them in more detail if they appeal to you in any way. Especially if you're responsible for the database of a commercial company where customers' records are at risk.